So verbs are probably the most useful of all the word classes to talk about across English language because they're so impactful, so meaningful, there's so many different types, and also they allow you to talk an awful lot about grammar as well. So if you're talking about how the verbs are constructed, you're probably hitting the higher level grammatical features as well. So you've probably been told in the past that verbs are doing words, and some verbs definitely are. So your doing words are dynamic verbs. So your actions ran, jumped, hid, climbed. They're your dynamic verbs. Yeah, dynamic is an action. Okay, but there are other types of verb as well. The stative or copular verbs we can call them. They are kind of having or being words. So they describe a state that you're in rather than what you actually do. So be or know. How you often sort of see them, or what you can say is they have a complement. So in other words, they will need a word to say, well, what do you know, or what are you? So I know the answers would be a complement. That's what you know. I am happy. So it's got an adjective or a noun that explains what you have, or what you are, or what you might be. There's also auxiliary verbs. They are just extra verbs that help the sentence make sense. So I was holding the baby. Was is an auxiliary verb that makes that sentence make sense. It doesn't really have meaning on its own. It just allows that sentence to make sense. However, there are certain types of auxiliary verb that are particularly useful. These are modals or modal auxiliary verbs. Now, these are secondary verbs, but they're words like will or shall or should or could or might or may. They've got a range of purposes, which I'll talk about shortly, but they are particularly meaningful. They often make a text say more or less certain, and we'll look at why they might do that shortly. And then you also may have come across these before, imperative verbs, where you give somebody an order. So walk quietly to your next lesson. Sit over there. It's an order. It's an instruction. It's what we have to do. Now, one way you can look at verbs is with tense or aspect. Now, past and present tense are quite straightforward. Are we describing what happened, or what happens, or what is happening around us, what's going on around us? That's the tense, but there can also be different aspects. So for aspect, this is slightly different to tense, and I'll show you an example in a second. Perfective aspect describes something that's already done with and has happened, but you might still be writing in present tense, or you might still be speaking in present tense, but you're describing something that's out the way of the main bit that you now want to talk about. Whereas progressive, you're describing something that's going on in the moment of that story, even if you're writing or speaking in past tense. You might be talking about something that's happened, but if you use progressive aspect, you're describing it as though it's going on right now. To give you an example of that, we get it here. So I've got these phrases in past and present tense. So in past tense, I had gone, I had walked, whereas past tense in progressive aspect, I was going, I was walking. Both of those are in past tense. We can see it's had or was. It's giving us the past tense. But in the perfective version, I had gone, I'd walked. We know that the next part is a bit we need to focus on. I'd walked so far, and then this happened. Whereas progressive, I was going, and that's the bit that we're going to focus on. Present tense, same thing. So I have gone, I have walked. That's still present tense. It's describing what you have done. It's in the present tense, but it's background information. Whereas I am going to scream at you if you don't stop talking or whatever. It's something that's going on right now. It's the bit that we're focusing on. To put this into a wider example, I'd cooked for my family and decided to watch TV, but as soon as I put my feet up, the dog came running through the house. He was wrecking everything in his path. That whole thing is in past tense. It's describing something that happened in the past. However, the first bit is perfective. The cooking for the family, deciding to watch TV, is the background information to add to the contrast of the chaos caused by the dog. The bit with the dog is progressive aspect. He came running in. He was wrecking everything. That's in the past, but it throws us into the moment. B, you should have already put your cake in the oven and prepared the icing to go on top. Then you can begin making the filling to go between the layers of sponge. That's all present tense. It's all describing what you are doing in this recipe. But the first bit is background information. That needs to be done first. And then what you need to focus on is making the filling to go between the layers of sponge. So there's tense, but there's also aspect. As a very general rule of thumb, if you see had or have before a word, then it's suggesting that it's going to be perfective. If it ends in ing, it's suggesting usually that it's going to be progressive. There's also active and passive voice. So most sentences are written in active voice. The dog chased the cat. We say who does the thing, then we say what the thing is that they do, then we say who had the thing done to them. So the dog is the subject, they're doing the action, chasing is the action, the cat is the one being chased. But if we flip that sentence around and say the cat was chased by the dog, suddenly we're in passive voice. We've switched the order. We're starting with the cat, who is the one who's having the thing done to it. We're starting with the object. Why this is important is in that second sentence you can get rid of the words by the dog. You could just say the cat was chased and suddenly the dog isn't blamed anymore. And we'll see sort of newspapers do this a lot. I've got some examples that we can look at where you might see that going on. Passive voice is very, very impactful and used for a range of purposes, but sometimes to avoid blame or accusation. So how we do this, if you want to sort of form it, and by all means, pause this to have a more detailed look. But most sentences are in active voice. If we switch the order around, we get it into passive. So the dog chased the cat. We've got subject, the one doing the action. Verb chased, what they're doing. The object, what was happening. We switch that order around. We start with the cat. So the cat's gone from being the object of the sentence to the subject. The verb has gone from chased, because the cat isn't doing the chasing, they were chased, and then the dog isn't the subject of the sentence because we focus on the cat, but they're the agent. They're still the one doing the action. They have agency. Okay, they're the one having that impact. If you want to have a go, all of those are in active voice. You could turn them into passive if you wanted to pause. So the police chased the burglars, for example, would turn into the burglars were chased by the police. So this can be very meaningful. The first sentence there just explains how you form it. If you think about the cups being smashed, a toddler even might say, it fell on the floor. They're using passive to avoid blame. They don't say, I smashed it or I dropped it. They say, it fell or it got smashed. They're avoiding blame. That's one way passive can often be used. A famous example is mistakes were made. A lot of politicians will say mistakes were made, because that's easier than saying I made a mistake or we made a mistake. They've avoided blame. You might, though, get it in more scientific text. So in that last example, the temperature of the room should be regularly checked. That's in passive, but that's not to avoid blaming anyone. It's just because it's not saying who should do it. It doesn't matter who does it. It just should happen. And often if texts want to be formal, they will use it for that reason. So it's not always about blame, but it may often be. So I said a bit earlier, you've got auxiliary verbs. These are extra verbs that you add to a sentence to make it make sense. I've gone home, have is your auxiliary, or I was running, was is your auxiliary verb. They don't have meaning on their own, but modal auxiliaries do. They are your ones that show certainty or doubt. Okay, may, must, will. There's three types here, and I think being able to accurately label these and talk about them will really help your analysis, because it allows you to go into the information about power and what the text is achieving. Okay, so the words themselves don't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a might or a must or a should. It can be any of these types. What is important is the function. So think about, what is this auxiliary doing? If it is showing what is more or less likely based on the knowledge, so if they show that you've deduced something, you've worked out, or something is more or less possible, or that you expect something, it's epistemic. So it might rain later. Okay, if you've looked at the weather forecast or you've looked at the clouds and it might rain later, you've deduced that from what is around you. The homework must be in the other book. Okay, so if you look for homework and it's not in the one book, you've worked out, you've deduced, or you've worked out that the most likely possibility is that it's in your other book. They're epistemics. Deontic give either obligation or permission. Okay, they're your big power ones. So you can have another biscuit. You're giving someone permission to do it, or you must do it tomorrow. You're obliging to. They need to do that tomorrow for you. They're very big on power. If you want to link to bases of power or influential or instrumental power, often deontic modals will help you do it. And then dynamic are kind of your more neutral ones. They show either ability, so he can score the most goals, he's got that ability, or habit. I would always clean my teeth first thing. Okay, they're your more neutral ones. The epistemic are good for texts that are showing informational power. Deontic are good for ones that are showing sort of instrumental power. The final one to be aware of is transitive and intransitive verbs. Any of the ones I've talked about can be transitive or intransitive. All it means is transitive verbs need an object. So please bring coffee. You wouldn't say please bring. That doesn't make sense. You need the object. What are they bringing? What's the thing that's being affected by that? Whereas intransitive makes sense without a direct object. I ran, she jumped. Ran, jumped. You don't need an object. You don't need to say what did you run or what did you jump. It's an action that you can just do without the object. Okay, so you could always think about whether words are transitive or intransitive. So to give you an example, we've looked at these texts before. This is the Guardian one. I wanted to show some examples here. So Boris Johnson has redrawn the map. That's perfective aspect there. Okay, it's present tense. He has done it, but it's been redrawn. It happened last night because the elections just happened. Okay, notice the contrast with the next bit. Labour and the Lib Dems are in disarray. That's simple present tense. It's happening right now. There's not an answer. Notice the complement. So it's a copular verb. They are. But then what are they? Well, they're in disarray, showing the chaos. That complement shows the chaos that they're in. Brexit will pass. Okay, I'd call that an epistemic modal because they're saying that based on the knowledge they have, that is definitely going to happen. That's the possibility or the certainty that's going to happen. Scottish independence will move to the centre of the stage. Another epistemic modal. They're showing their informational power. They know this. Facts are sacred. Again, they're showing their informational power. Copular verb are. What are they? What's your complement? They're sacred. So we're saying, well, we're going to give you the facts. And it says any response must start with the facts. That's a deontic modal there. They're saying that they are obliged to give us the facts. They're giving themselves the informational power because they'll always tell us the truth. And then the last one I want to look at, the Tories have a majority of 80. So again, another copular verb, they have. It's not an action. It's something that they have or that they own. What do they have? A majority. So that noun is the complement. That's the power that they have. So it grants power to the Conservative Party. Through those verbs, hopefully you can see the amount of power that the Guardian gives to themselves, but also to the Conservative Party. Compare it to the one in the Mirror where Jeremy Corbyn issues this apology letter. So he issues first apology, okay? So that verb issues, dynamic verb, he's done it. But what has he issued? An apology. That's the object, okay? That's the object that he's given. So it's him showing that he's sort of giving this up to other people. Next bit, Jeremy Corbyn vowed a turnaround. So again, he has vowed it. He's promised that this will happen, but what has he vowed? Oh, that there will be a turnaround. So in that case, I'd call it a copular verb. I know vowed is a tricky one because in some ways it's dynamic. It's something that he's done, but I think it's more of a state of being in this case. It's something that he's promising, sort of going forward. What is he promising? What's your complement? A turnaround. That's what's going to come. And then the next bit we get, Labour will learn from its election disaster. So we get the verb learn. What's it learning from? What's the object? The election disaster. He will listen. What's the object? Who he listen to voters. So all of this is about him, taking this information on from the voters. And then who abandoned, the verb, they're the subject now. What did they do? Who did they abandon? The party, the object. So lots of dynamic verbs there, and that's subject and object showing that relationship that the voters have abandoned the party. But now Jeremy Corbyn is saying, I will move this party back to what you want. And finally, the example from The Sun, the review. That first one, those Channel 4 lefties quit laughing at 10 p.m. That's a great example there, I think, because it's in past tense, but I think that's one that's using progressive aspects. It's a weird one because it's not saying they were laughing. It doesn't use the auxiliary. It's a weird verb construction that they quit laughing, but it throws us into that moment right at 10 p.m. where that stopped. So that adverb of time at 10 p.m. shows us the exact moment when it changed. And obviously Ali Ross was very happy about the election result. He says, I've got to ask. We get the deontic modal there. I've got to ask. I'm obliged to ask. But he's not giving us power as such. He's kind of just mocking what he calls the lefties who he's laughing at. And then we get, please tell me you were, that imperative verb. But notice he's not doing it to get power over us. Normally imperative verbs are. In this case, he's bringing us into the conversation. Please tell me you were. That imperative is softened with please, but also he's not actually asking us to tell him. It's just making it feel that little bit more personal. And he said it had just gone midnight. That's your perfective aspect. Yeah, he's thrown us back into that moment where midnight was out the way, and then Nish bellowed, still past tense, but that's a bit he wants us to focus on. Notice that dynamic verb, bellowed. This whole text is trying to make the lefties, as Ali Ross describes them, seem like irrational, crazed people, and I think bellowed adds to that massively there. So I think the verbs in this case are particularly impactful. They allow you to start touching on grammar, but they also allow you in a big way to talk about power and the relationships and the audience and the purpose and the positioning, which are crucial for any bit of analysis.